The Anchor Bar sat on the edge of Coronado, California, just a short walk from the Naval Special Warfare Center. It was the kind of place where young sailors came to blow off steam, where the beer was cheap and the stories were tall. On a Friday night in March, the bar was packed with the usual crowd, junior officers, enlisted men, and a handful of civilians who didn't know any better than to wander into a Navy watering hole. Commander Sarah Chen sat alone at a corner table, nursing a ginger ale. To anyone watching, she was just another middle-aged woman in a quiet corner. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain blue windbreaker. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. That was exactly how she wanted it. Sarah had been coming to the Anchor Bar for 3 weeks now, gathering information. Her real mission couldn't be discussed, couldn't be shared, and certainly couldn't be advertised. She was hunting someone, a naval officer with a spotless record and a secret that would shake the Navy to its core. That officer was someone who worked just outside the base, someone who thought he was untouchable. And that officer had no idea that the quiet woman in the corner was one of the most decorated operatives the Navy had ever trained. 23 years ago, Sarah had completed SEAL team training. She was one of the first women to do it. She had served in 8 combat deployments. She had trained some of the finest operators in the military. She had received commendations she couldn't talk about and completed missions that didn't officially exist. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, she was invisible. "Hey, watch it," a loud voice cut through her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see a young ensign, maybe 23 years old, stumbling backward. He had spilled his beer on the floor. His name was Ensign Marcus Reed, and Sarah had been watching him for the past week. He was cocky, loud, and drunk more often than he was sober. He was also the nephew of the officer Sarah was tracking, and he spent a lot of time at this bar talking about family business he had no business discussing. Marcus turned to find the source of his spilled drink. His eyes landed on Sarah, and he frowned. "You," he said, pointing a finger at her. "You made me spill my beer." Sarah set down her glass carefully. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has stared death in the face and decided not to blink. "What are you doing here anyway?" Marcus continued, his words slurring slightly. "This is a military bar. You're not military. You're just some old lady taking up space." There was a moment of silence at the tables nearby. A few sailors glanced over, waiting to see what would happen. Sarah stood up slowly. She was about 5'8", lean and fit, the kind of body that came from 3 decades of disciplined training. She stepped toward Marcus, her movements smooth and controlled. Marcus, emboldened by alcohol and youth, didn't back down. Instead, he raised his hand and shoved her backward. It wasn't a hard shove. It wasn't meant to be aggressive so much as dismissive, the kind of shove a drunk man gives when he wants someone to go away and leave him alone. But it was a shove nonetheless. His hand connected with her shoulder, and Sarah stumbled backward, catching herself against the table. "Stay out of my way, lady," Marcus said, turning back to his friends. Sarah straightened her windbreaker. A few sailors were watching now, uncertain whether they had just witnessed something serious or just drunken foolishness. Sarah said nothing. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door. As she passed Marcus, she stopped for just a moment. "You should be more careful," she said quietly. "One day you might push the wrong person." Marcus laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Threats from Grandma, that's the saddest thing I've heard all week." Sarah walked out into the cool night air. The Pacific was close enough to smell, salt, and endless depth. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "It's Chen," she said when the other end picked up. "I've got what we need." Ensign Reed was talking about his uncle's operation in his letters. His friends confirmed at least 3 suspicious transfers. We can move forward with the investigation. There was a pause on the other end. "You okay?" the voice asked. It was her commanding officer, Captain James Thompson. "I'm fine," Sarah said. "Just a drunk kid who doesn't know who he's dealing with." "Want me to have him brought in?" "No," Sarah said. "Not yet. Let's not tip anyone off. We'll get everything we need through proper channels. The kid was just doing what kids do, talking too much at a bar. His uncle's the problem. His uncle is the one who's been running black market weapons deals and selling them to unauthorized buyers. That's who we're going after." After she hung up, Sarah walked back to her car, a nondescript sedan parked 2 blocks away. As she drove back to the small apartment she was renting in San Diego, she thought about the ensign. He was young. He was stupid. But he wasn't evil. He was just like so many other young sailors, immature, unsure of himself, trying to prove something by being loud and aggressive. But his uncle was different. His uncle, Captain Richard Reed, had been in the Navy for 31 years. He had a stellar record. He had been promoted twice, commended 3 times, and trusted with classified information. On the surface, he was exactly the kind of officer the Navy wanted: disciplined, capable, loyal. But for the past 5 years, he had been selling that loyalty to the highest bidder. Sarah had been tracking him for months. The weapons weren't the only problem. Reed had been passing along information about troop movements, supply lines, and operational details to private military contractors and foreign buyers. People had died because of his betrayal, American soldiers and Afghan civilians alike. The blood was on his hands, and Sarah was going to make sure he paid for it. But she couldn't do it alone. She had spent 3 weeks in that bar building a case, getting evidence, recording conversations. She had 1 more week, maybe 2, before they had enough to bring him in. 1 more week of being invisible, 1 more week of being underestimated and dismissed. As she drove through the quiet streets of San Diego, Sarah thought about the shove. It didn't bother her. Physical contact like that barely registered anymore. She had been through so much worse: explosions, gunfire, interrogation, drowning sensations during underwater training that made your body scream for air. A drunk ensign's hand on her shoulder was nothing. But it bothered her in a different way. It bothered her that people like Marcus could go through life never understanding the cost of the protection they took for granted. It bothered her that young men could shove women they didn't know and laugh about it without consequence. It bothered her that evil men like Captain Reed could hide behind their uniforms and their rank and their spotless records. That was why she did this work. That was why she spent weeks being invisible, being underestimated, being dismissed. Because someone had to make sure that people like Marcus and Richard Reed didn't get away with their crimes. Tomorrow, she would go back to the Anchor Bar. She would sit in her corner. She would gather more evidence. And in another week or 2, when she had everything she needed, she would watch as Captain Richard Reed was arrested on federal charges of espionage and weapons trafficking. But tonight, she went home, made herself a simple dinner, and reviewed the surveillance footage 1 more time, looking for anything she might have missed. The undercover operation would continue. And Sarah Chen, the woman Marcus had shoved in the bar, would make sure that justice was served. 2 days after the incident at the Anchor Bar, Sarah was back in her usual corner. The bartender, a man named Jerry who was in his 60s, had started to recognize her. He didn't know who she was, but he had begun to treat her like a regular, bringing her ginger ale without being asked, not bothering her when she sat alone with her quiet demeanor. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Captain Thompson. "Got the warrant. 3 phones, 2 email accounts, all of Reed's communication channels. We're ready when you are." This was the moment Sarah had been working toward. They had finally gathered enough evidence from the conversations she had overheard and recorded in the bar. Now they could officially wiretap Captain Reed's communications. They could access his financial records. They could start building a prosecution case that would hold up in court. But there was a complication. Ensign Marcus Reed had just walked into the Anchor Bar, and he was with his uncle. Sarah's heart rate increased by maybe 5 beats per minute. For most people, that would have been noticeable. For Sarah, it was barely a physiological response. She had trained herself over decades to control her body's reactions. Fear didn't show. Surprise didn't show. She was a blank slate, a mirror that reflected back nothing. Captain Richard Reed was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of posture that came from 30 years of military discipline. He was handsome in a strong way, the kind of man who would naturally command a room. He had kind eyes when he wasn't looking at you directly. Those eyes had fooled a lot of people. The 2 men sat down at a table about 15 feet from Sarah. No one else was close enough to hear their conversation, but Sarah could. She had good hearing, and they weren't bothering to keep their voices down. Military men often didn't, especially when they were in uniform spaces where they felt safe. "You need to be more careful," Captain Reed was telling his nephew, his voice low but serious. "I heard you were running your mouth at this bar last week. Someone mentioned you were talking about family business." Marcus looked embarrassed. "It was nothing, Uncle Richard, just some guys talking. Nobody was listening." "People are always listening," Reed said. "That's lesson number 1 in this business. You never know who's paying attention. You never know who might be a threat." Sarah's fingers moved slightly as she pretended to check something on her phone. In reality, she was activating the recording device in her jacket pocket. It was small, sophisticated, and completely invisible. Every word they said would be captured. "I understand," Marcus said, and he sounded genuinely chastened. "I'll be more careful." "See that you do," Reed said. "What we're doing is important. It's important to people who matter. It's important to our financial future. But it only works if we keep our mouths shut. It only works if we stay invisible." There was an ironic echo in those words, "stay invisible." Sarah almost smiled. She had been following that advice for her entire career. "How much longer?" Marcus asked. He sounded young, uncertain. "When do we see real money?" "Another month," Reed said. "Maybe 6 weeks. The buyer from Dubai is completing his due diligence. Once he confirms he can move the merchandise, we'll get the final payment. $2 million split among the 4 of us." $2 million. This was bigger than Sarah had suspected. This wasn't just about passing information or helping foreign operatives. This was organized, professional, and deeply criminal, and there were 4 people involved. She had confirmed 2, Reed and someone else. She needed to know who the other 2 were. "Who else is involved?" Marcus asked. "Besides you and Dmitri." Sarah's ears perked up. Dmitri, that was a Russian name, weapons trafficking and a Russian connection. This was becoming clearer by the minute. "You don't need to know," Reed said. "What you need to know is that this operation is bigger than you, bigger than me, and bigger than anything the Navy can touch. We have protection. We have people inside federal agencies. When this is done, we disappear and nobody will ever find us." A chill ran through Sarah's mind. People inside federal agencies. That meant Reed had connections beyond just the military. That meant this investigation was going to be far more complicated than they had originally thought. The 2 men stood up to leave. Marcus hugged his uncle. It was a strange moment of genuine family affection in the middle of serious federal crimes. That was something people often didn't understand about cases like this. The criminals weren't monsters. They were people. They had families. They loved the people they were betraying. They just chose to do it anyway. After they left, Sarah waited 5 minutes, then stood and left a few dollars on her table for Jerry. She walked out into the cool evening air and called Captain Thompson immediately. "We have a Russian connection," she said without preamble. "Name is Dmitri, unknown last name, multiple buyers, possibly from the Middle East. They're expecting a payment of $2 million in 4 to 6 weeks, and Captain Reed says they have protection inside federal agencies." There was a long silence on the other end. "Inside federal agencies?" Thompson finally said. "Are you sure?" "Direct quote," Sarah said. "He told his nephew that they have people in federal agencies and that the Navy can't touch them." "This just went from bad to worse," Thompson said. "I need to brief the director. This isn't just a military problem anymore. This is counterintelligence. This is national security." "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked. "Stay in place," Thompson said. "Keep gathering intelligence, but be careful. If Reed thinks there's someone investigating him, he'll run, and if he runs, we might never catch him." Sarah ended the call and drove back to her apartment. The case was becoming more serious by the hour. She had stumbled onto something far bigger than a single corrupt captain selling weapons. This was a conspiracy that reached into the federal government itself. For the next 3 days, Sarah didn't go to the Anchor Bar. Instead, she worked with the FBI task force that Thompson had brought in. She spent hours in a secure facility reviewing phone records, email communications, and financial transactions. Every day, the picture became clearer and more troubling. Captain Reed had been moving money through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The Russian man named Dmitri had connections to organized crime groups in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The mysterious 4th member of their group had a secure phone number that couldn't be easily traced, but the FBI's cyber forensics team was working on it. And then on the 4th day, Sarah got a lead. The 4th member of the conspiracy was a woman. That's all the cyber team could tell her at first. Just a woman, someone with enough technical knowledge to use encryption software and enough access to something to matter. A woman inside the federal government. Sarah sat in the secure facility, staring at the information on the screen. A woman. That meant the conspiracy ran deeper than anyone had realized. It meant there was a female operative on the inside, someone trusted enough to have access to classified materials and communications. It took another 2 days of investigation, but finally they found her. Dr. Alina Volkov. She worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was a signals analyst with a 15-year security clearance. She was born in Moscow, immigrated to the United States at age 12, and had become a U.S. citizen at 21. She had a spotless record, a good salary, and no obvious financial problems, which made her recruitment all the more mysterious. Why would someone like Alina Volkov risk everything for money she didn't need? What leverage did the Russians have over her? Captain Thompson brought Sarah in for a briefing with the FBI agent leading the investigation. His name was Robert Hayes, and he was in his 50s with gray temples and tired eyes. "We're at a critical juncture," Hayes said, spreading photographs across the table. "We have enough evidence to arrest Captain Reed, but if we do, Volkov will disappear. She'll run to Mexico or Canada or somewhere we can't reach her. And if she has a handler in Moscow, she'll take everything she knows with her." "What about Dmitri?" Sarah asked. "Dmitri is bait," Hayes said. "He's a middleman, a facilitator. He'll lead us to the Russian end of the operation. But we need to move carefully. We need to let this play out until we have everyone." Sarah understood what he was saying, but she didn't like it. It meant letting the conspiracy continue. It meant allowing weapons to move, allowing classified information to be sold, allowing criminals to operate freely. "How long?" she asked. 3 weeks, Hayes said. "Maybe 4. That's how long we have until the big buy. That's when Dmitri meets with the Arab buyers. That's when the final payment is made. That's when we move in and take everyone down." 3 weeks. Sarah could do 3 weeks. She had done harder things. She had waited longer for less important operations. But she also knew that every day they waited, every day Captain Reed walked free and Dr. Alina Volkov continued her work at the Defense Intelligence Agency, there was a risk. A risk that something would go wrong. A risk that someone would figure out they were being watched. "I'll go back to the bar," Sarah said. "I'll keep gathering intelligence on Reed's movements. I'll find out more about the Arab buyers." Hayes nodded. "That's what we need. Reed knows you as just some random woman who spilled his nephew's beer. He has no reason to suspect you. Keep it that way." Sarah left the briefing with a weight on her shoulders that had nothing to do with the physical facts of her life. This operation had grown far beyond what she had expected. This wasn't just about punishing one corrupt officer. This was about national security, about foreign intelligence operations, about people inside the government working against the country they had sworn to protect. That night, Sarah went back to the Anchor Bar. She sat in her corner table, and she waited for the conspirators to return, knowing that every moment that passed was a moment they were still operating, still betraying, still selling secrets that might get people killed. 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah continued her routine with the precision of someone who had spent 23 years in the military. She arrived at the Anchor Bar on Friday and Saturday nights, always between 8 and 11 p.m. She ordered ginger ale. She sat alone. She watched and listened. Captain Reed came to the bar 5 times during those 3 weeks. Each time he was with someone different, sometimes Marcus, sometimes a man in civilian clothes who Sarah recognized from the FBI photos as Dmitri, sometimes alone with his phone, conducting quiet conversations that Sarah recorded. The pattern was becoming clear. The transaction was scheduled for early April. The Arab buyers from Dubai were coming to San Diego. They would inspect the merchandise, a shipment of 50 advanced surveillance drones that Reed had obtained through black market military suppliers. They would verify the classified intelligence package that Dr. Alina Volkov was compiling about American military capabilities in the Middle East. They would complete the payment of $2 million, and then it would all be over. For them, it would be a criminal triumph. For Sarah, it would be the moment when the trap sprang shut. But waiting was wearing on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sarah had been trained to separate herself from her emotions. Stoicism was a survival mechanism in her line of work. You couldn't afford to feel fear in combat. You couldn't afford to feel doubt when you made decisions that might kill people. You couldn't afford to grieve for the friends you lost or the civilians who died because of operations gone wrong. But this operation was different. This wasn't combat. This was a slow-burning investigation where she was doing nothing but watching and waiting. And in the quiet moments between gatherings of intelligence, she had too much time to think. She thought about her family. Her son was 32 now, working as a doctor in Seattle. He had barely known his father, who had died when Sarah was still active duty. Sarah had missed so much of her son's childhood. She had missed his first day of school because she was deployed in Afghanistan. She had missed his high school graduation because she was on a classified operation. She had missed watching him grow up because she was too busy protecting people she would never meet and doing work she could never talk about. She thought about the other women she had trained. Some of them had left the service. They had families now, real families, not the kind of fractured relationships that came from spending 2/3 of the year deployed. They had normal lives. They had husbands who came home at 6 p.m. They had children who knew their faces. They had homes where the biggest problem was finding time for a dinner date. Sarah had never had any of that. She had the Navy. She had the mission. She had the work, and the work was important. The work saved lives, but it also cost her something in ways she was only now beginning to understand. On the 21st day of the operation, something happened that broke Sarah's careful emotional distance. She was sitting at her corner table when Marcus Reed walked in with another young sailor. Marcus was drunk, more drunk than she had seen him before. His friend was trying to hold him up as they walked toward the bar. "No, listen," Marcus was saying loudly. "Listen, I'm serious. My uncle is going to be rich, like seriously rich, and he said he'd remember me. He said he'd help me out financially when this thing closes." Sarah's instincts had saved her life many times. She leaned back slightly, angling away from the young men as if she was trying to be less visible. "Reed's smart," Marcus continued, slurring his words. "He's figured out how to make real money, not Navy money, real money. $2 million for just moving some equipment and information. 2 million, that's genius, that's." The friend tried to quiet him down. "Hey man, you're talking too loud, people can hear you." "I don't care," Marcus said. "Nobody here cares, it's just some old people, it's just—" Marcus's eyes landed on Sarah and he froze. Recognition flickered across his drunk face. "It's the lady from before," he said, pointing. "It's the old lady I pushed." The entire bar seemed to go quiet. Sarah's mind ran through the calculations instantly. It was a threat. Not an immediate physical threat, but a threat nonetheless. If Marcus continued talking, if he started spreading rumors about his uncle's illegal activities, Reed might become suspicious. Reed might realize he was being watched. Sarah stood up slowly. She walked toward the bar where Marcus was standing with his friend, and she did something that surprised everyone in the bar. She smiled. "Hey there, Ensign," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "How are you doing?" Marcus blinked at her, confused. This was not the response he had expected from the woman he had shoved 3 weeks ago. "I'm doing good," he said uncertainly. "That's good," Sarah said. "I'm sorry I was in your way that night. Military bars are for military people. I shouldn't have been there. I'll stay away from here from now on." "Okay." Something in her voice was different. It was kind. It was understanding. It was the voice of someone older and wiser choosing not to escalate a conflict. Marcus's aggressive posture softened. "Yeah, okay," he said. "No problem." Sarah touched his arm gently. "You should take care of yourself," she said. "Drink some water before you have another beer, and think carefully about what you want to do with your life. You seem like a good kid. Don't let anyone push you into doing things you'll regret." It was a loaded statement, and though Marcus didn't understand all the layers of what she was saying, something in her words resonated with him. His drunken anger deflated. He nodded. Sarah returned to her table. The crisis had been averted, but it had reminded her of something important. She was close to a young man who was about to watch his uncle be arrested and convicted of federal crimes. She was close to the moment when his life would be disrupted, his family would be torn apart, and his future would be marked by association with his uncle's crimes. It wasn't Marcus's fault. He was just a kid following his uncle's lead, not fully understanding the consequences of the world he was entering. But that wouldn't matter when the arrest came. That wouldn't protect him from the fallout. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what she was doing. Not the physical weight, not the danger which she had learned to manage, but the emotional weight of knowing that her investigation, her careful work, her sacrifice and patience would destroy lives. She called her commanding officer. "It's Chen," she said. "I need to talk about what happens to Marcus Reed after the arrest." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" Thompson asked. "I mean he's just a kid who doesn't understand what he's involved in. When his uncle is arrested, Marcus becomes a person of interest. His family is destroyed. His career in the Navy becomes untenable. He'll be forever associated with his uncle's crimes, even if he wasn't involved." "That's not our concern," Thompson said gently. "Our concern is catching the criminals and protecting national security. What happens to Marcus Reed is his own responsibility." "He's 23 years old," Sarah said. "He's stupid and young and drunk most of the time, but he's not evil, and he's about to be collateral damage in an operation he never volunteered for." "Sarah," Thompson said, and his voice was careful now, the voice of someone talking to another person who was carrying too much. "You've been in this operation for too long. You're too close to it. You're starting to sympathize with the target." "I'm not sympathizing with Richard Reed," Sarah said. "I'm not sympathizing with Dr. Volkov. I'm sympathizing with a kid who didn't ask to be part of his uncle's crimes." "That's exactly what I mean," Thompson said. "You need to separate yourself from the human element. You need to remember why you're doing this. You're doing this because Reed is selling weapons. You're doing this because Volkov is passing classified information that will get Americans killed. You're doing this because national security is more important than anyone's personal inconvenience." He was right, of course he was right. Sarah had known this for 23 years. The mission always came first. Personal feelings, family concerns, collateral damage, these were all secondary to the larger goal. But knowing that and feeling that were two different things. Sarah thanked Thompson and ended the call. She lay in bed that night thinking about all the collateral damage she had caused over the years. She thought about the families of terrorists she had killed. She thought about the innocent people who had died in operations she had participated in. She thought about all the small ways that her work had rippled through the world, disrupting lives and destroying futures. This was the cost of her service. This was the price she paid for the protection she provided. And it was a price that was becoming harder to pay as she got older. 3 days later, the operation reached its final phase. The Arab buyers from Dubai were arriving on Sunday. The transaction was scheduled for Monday afternoon at a warehouse on the outskirts of San Diego. Richard Reed, Alina Volkov, Dmitry, and the Arab buyers would all be there. And so would the FBI. Sarah's role was almost finished. She had one more thing to do. She had to be in the right place at the right time to serve as a witness to the final exchanges, to confirm that the conspiracy had reached its conclusion. On Sunday evening, Sarah went to the Anchor Bar one last time. She sat at her corner table and ordered her ginger ale. Around 9 p.m., Richard Reed walked in. He looked tired. Sarah could see the weight on his shoulders, the stress in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around the room looking for threats. He was close to the end of the operation, close to the moment when either he would succeed or everything would fall apart. He ordered a whiskey and sat alone, drinking and waiting. Sarah watched him, and in that moment she saw him clearly. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made terrible choices. He was a man who had chosen money and power over integrity and loyalty. He was a man who was about to pay the price for those choices. Sarah finished her ginger ale, left cash on the table, and walked out of the Anchor Bar for the last time. Tomorrow the trap would spring. The warehouse on the outskirts of San Diego looked like 1,000 other warehouses in Southern California, corrugated metal walls, rolling garage doors, surrounded by chain-link fencing and struggling weeds. The FBI had been watching it for 2 days, setting up cameras and recording equipment, preparing for the moment when the conspiracy would reach its conclusion. Sarah stood in a command center 2 blocks away, dressed in tactical gear that she hadn't worn in 5 years. It felt natural, like coming home. Around her, agents and military personnel monitored phones, computers, and live feeds from cameras positioned around the warehouse. It was 1:47 p.m. on Monday, April 15th. In 13 minutes, Richard Reed would arrive at the warehouse. In 20 minutes, the Arab buyers would pull up in a black SUV. In 40 minutes, the FBI would move in and arrest everyone inside. Sarah's job was simple. She needed to be there, visible, as a witness to the crime. She needed to observe the transaction and confirm that the weapons and classified information had been exchanged for money. At 1:50 p.m., a car pulled into the warehouse parking lot. Richard Reed got out, looking nervous. He was followed by Dr. Alina Volkov, who emerged from the passenger seat. She was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with dark eyes and the tense posture of someone who knew they were walking toward a precipice. At 1:58 p.m., a second car arrived. Dmitry stepped out, followed by 2 men in business casual clothes who Sarah recognized from the FBI briefing as the Arab buyers. All positions, stand by. The operation commander's voice came through Sarah's earpiece. Let's get eyes inside the warehouse. Sarah moved toward the building. She had been given a cover story. She was a delivery driver for a shipping company, and she needed to drop off a package. She had a uniform, a truck parked nearby, and legitimate documentation. It was the kind of cover that could hold up to casual scrutiny but would fall apart under any real investigation. She approached the warehouse door with the package in her hands. The rolling garage door was partially open. She could see inside, a large empty space with the 4 conspirators and 2 wooden crates stacked in the center. "Package for Reed," she called out, stepping inside. All 5 heads turned toward her. For a moment there was confusion. Then recognition flashed across Richard Reed's face. "I don't know you," he said sharply. "What are you doing here?" Sarah set the package down and pulled out her credentials. But instead of a delivery driver's ID, she showed them her Navy Command badge. "Commander Sarah Chen," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Naval Criminal Investigative Service. You're all under arrest for weapons trafficking, espionage, and conspiracy to commit treason against the United States." For a moment there was absolute silence, then chaos erupted. One of the Arab buyers reached toward his jacket. An FBI agent burst through the side door, weapon drawn, screaming, "Federal agent, show your hands." Dimitri tried to run toward the back of the warehouse. Another FBI agent tackled him to the ground. Richard Reed stood frozen, his face going pale as he understood the magnitude of his error. Dr. Alina Volkov didn't run. She didn't fight. She simply sank to her knees, her hands over her face, and began to cry. It took 10 minutes to secure all 5 suspects. It took another 20 minutes for the military forensics team to confirm that the wooden crates contained the surveillance drones and that the classified information package was indeed present. By 2:30 p.m., all 5 conspirators were in custody, read their rights, and being transported to separate detention facilities. The Anchor Bar conspiracy, as the FBI was calling it, was finished. Sarah stood in the warehouse and watched the arrests being finalized. She should have felt satisfied. She should have felt victorious. She had spent nearly a month gathering intelligence. She had sacrificed her identity, her comfort, her emotional distance. She had done her job perfectly. But what she actually felt was empty. Richard Reed was led past her in handcuffs. Their eyes met for just a moment. In his eyes, Sarah saw something that made her deeply uncomfortable. She saw pity. He was looking at her with an expression that suggested he felt sorry for the woman who had brought him down, for the person who had chosen to be invisible in order to catch him. That look haunted her more than anything else that had happened in the operation. By that evening, the news had broken. A high-ranking Navy officer had been arrested for weapons trafficking and espionage. The news channels were running stories about the security breach, about the classified information that had been compromised, about the diplomatic incident with Dubai that had to be quickly managed. But there was one thing the news didn't report, one crucial detail that didn't make it into the public narrative. 3 days after the arrest, Captain Thompson called Sarah into a secure briefing room. He looked troubled in a way that Sarah had rarely seen before. "There's a problem," he said without preamble. "The Arab buyers weren't actually Arab buyers." Sarah's heart rate didn't change, but something shifted inside her. "What do you mean?" "I mean they were CIA assets," Thompson said. "They were running a counterintelligence operation of their own, trying to identify which Americans were willing to sell classified information to foreign powers. They were setting a trap at the same time we were." "Were they working with us?" Sarah asked. "No," Thompson said. "That's the problem. They were a completely separate operation, which means we just exposed a CIA investigation without authorization, which means the real buyer, the person we were trying to trace back to Russian intelligence, slipped through our fingers while we were arresting Reed." Sarah processed this information without any visible reaction. Who was the real buyer? "Unknown," Thompson said. "He was in the warehouse with a fake identity. He slipped out during the chaos of the arrests. We have no idea who he is or who he was working for." There was a long silence. Sarah understood immediately what this meant. The real criminal, the person at the center of the conspiracy, the person who was actually running the operation and funneling classified information to hostile powers, had escaped. "So this was all for nothing," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Thompson said. We still arrested Reed and Volkov. We still stopped the sale of the surveillance drones. We still prevented classified information from reaching foreign hands. But you're right, we missed the primary target. The person orchestrating all of this is still out there. Sarah left the briefing room feeling something she hadn't felt before. She felt like she had failed. Not in any objective sense, the operation had been technically successful. But in the ways that mattered, in the ways that actually protected national security and safeguarded American lives, she had failed. That night, she visited the Anchor Bar one final time, though she was no longer undercover and no longer invisible. Jerry, the bartender, didn't recognize her at first. She was wearing her navy dress uniform, medals on her chest, insignia on her shoulders. When he finally placed her, the quiet woman in the corner, his eyes widened. "You were in the Navy," he said. "I am in the Navy," Sarah corrected gently. "Still am." "You caught that officer," Jerry said. It wasn't a question. The news had been all over the local media for days. "We did," Sarah said. "Though the way it turned out, I'm not sure we caught the person we were really looking for." She sat at the bar, and Jerry brought her a drink without asking. They sat in companionable silence for a while. "The kid, Marcus Reed, he came in here a few days ago," Jerry finally said. "He looked destroyed. He kept asking if anyone knew where his uncle was going when he'd get out. I told him I didn't know anything." Sarah nodded. She understood the cost of what she had done. She understood that catching criminals meant destroying families. But she had been trained not to think about those costs, not to let them affect her judgment. Except now, for the first time in her career, she was beginning to understand that maybe she should think about those costs. Maybe they mattered. "Tell me something," Sarah said to Jerry. "If you had known that the quiet woman in the corner was an undercover Navy officer, what would you have thought?" Jerry smiled sadly. "I would have thought exactly what I think now, that you were doing a job that needed doing, even if it wasn't pleasant, even if it broke hearts along the way." Sarah finished her drink and paid for it. As she was leaving, she heard Jerry call out, "That officer you were investigating, Reed, he didn't deserve what he did. But neither did you deserve to spend a month being invisible." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Sarah in a very long time. 30 days after the arrest of Captain Richard Reed, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. She was in her apartment in San Diego, going through official reports of the operation when her encrypted phone rang. The number was classified. She answered immediately. "Commander Chen." The voice was unfamiliar, a woman older with authority in her tone. "This is Chen," Sarah confirmed. "This is Deputy Director Margaret Walsh with the CIA. I need to brief you on a matter concerning your recent operation. Specifically, I need to tell you what really happened in that warehouse." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She moved to her secure laptop and opened an encrypted video call. Deputy Director Walsh's face appeared on the screen, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and gray hair. "The man who escaped from the warehouse," Walsh began, "was not a foreign intelligence operative. He was one of our own." Sarah's mind processed this. Someone from the CIA was running the conspiracy. "Exactly," Walsh said. "His name is Michael Hartley. He's been with the agency for 27 years. He's been conducting an unauthorized operation to identify which American military and intelligence personnel would be willing to sell classified information. He was using fake buyers and fake transactions to test the loyalty of hundreds of people across the military and intelligence communities." "That's insane," Sarah said. "That's completely unauthorized." "Completely," Walsh agreed. Hartley believed that the official government vetting procedures weren't thorough enough. He believed that the only way to truly identify traitors was to offer them money and see who took it. So for the past 3 years, he's been running his own black budget operation, approaching military officers and intelligence personnel with fake opportunities to sell information. "And he approached Richard Reed," Sarah said, beginning to understand. "Reed was the 34th person Hartley approached," Walsh said. "He was the 11th person who actually took the bait. What Hartley didn't anticipate was that NCIS would be running its own investigation into Reed at the same time. He didn't anticipate you." "So the Arab buyers were Hartley's assets," Sarah said. "Yes," Walsh confirmed. "Hartley was trying to catch Reed and Volkov in the act of selling information to what appeared to be foreign buyers. He was going to arrest them himself, using his own unauthorized authority. But then you showed up, and the FBI showed up, and suddenly his operation went sideways. Sarah was beginning to feel a strange mix of emotions: anger, confusion, and something else that she couldn't quite identify. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because Michael Hartley has disappeared," Walsh said. "When the warehouse operation went wrong, he slipped away. He had a contingency plan. He transferred all of his operation files to an encrypted server before he vanished. We don't know where he is now." "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. "I want you to understand something," Walsh said. "You were doing your job. You were investigating genuine crimes. Richard Reed did sell classified information, and that's real. Alina Volkov did pass along military secrets, and that's real. They're guilty, and they deserve to be prosecuted. But they're also the ones Michael Hartley caught in his trap. They're victims of his unauthorized operation as much as they are criminals." "That doesn't change what they did," Sarah said. "No, it doesn't," Walsh agreed. "But it provides context, it provides understanding, and perhaps it provides some clarity about the nature of justice and vengeance in this business we're in." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the dark of her apartment for a long time, processing what she had learned. The conspiracy she had brought to justice was real, but it was also just one part of a much larger, much darker operation. The CIA had been conducting unauthorized investigations for 3 years. Military officers had been approached by fake buyers offering to sell secrets. And somewhere in that tangled web of operations, Michael Hartley had slipped away, presumably still conducting his unauthorized vetting mission. 2 weeks later, Sarah was called to testify before a classified Senate committee. She was asked about her operation, her findings, her evidence. She testified that the crimes were real, that the conspiracy was genuine, that Richard Reed and Alina Volkov had actually attempted to sell secrets to foreign buyers. But she also testified that the operation that had exposed them was not what it appeared to be. She testified that there had been a CIA operation running parallel to the investigation. She testified that a high-ranking CIA official had been conducting unauthorized activities, and that he was now at large. Within a month, the entire situation had exploded into a major government scandal. The CIA Inspector General opened an investigation into Michael Hartley's activities. The Pentagon launched its own review of how many military officers had been approached by fake buyers. Congressional committees demanded answers. And in the middle of all this chaos, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. She was called to a secure facility outside of San Diego. When she arrived, she was brought to a room where Marcus Reed was waiting. He was no longer drunk. He was no longer cocky. He was a young man who had aged 5 years in 5 weeks. "I wanted to thank you," he said without preamble. "I wanted to thank you for what you did." Sarah was confused. "I arrested your uncle." "Yes," Marcus said, "and you probably saved my life. When my uncle was recruiting me, when he was telling me about the money and the operation, I was going to take the bait. I was going to get involved. I was going to become a criminal just like him." Sarah understood then. Her operation had stopped Marcus from making a terrible mistake. Her investigation had prevented him from joining his uncle's conspiracy. "The Navy is moving me to a new unit," Marcus continued. "New station, new people, new start. I'm going to have a chance to actually become a good officer, to do the right thing. I have you to thank for that." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in the room, and she finally allowed herself to cry. She had spent a month being invisible. She had sacrificed her comfort and her emotional distance. She had brought down a conspiracy and prevented national security breaches. And in doing all of that, she had saved a young man from making terrible decisions. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what justice really meant, not just punishment but prevention, not just vengeance but redemption. 3 months later, the full scope of Michael Hartley's operation was finally revealed. He had tested 87 military officers and intelligence personnel. 23 of them had been willing to sell classified information. 17 others had reported the approach to their superiors, doing the right thing. The remaining 47 had simply refused and walked away. Michael Hartley himself was never found. There were occasional reports of sightings in Mexico, in Canada, in Central America. But he remained at large, presumably still conducting his unofficial vetting operations somewhere outside the reach of official authority. Richard Reed was convicted of weapons trafficking and espionage. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Alina Volkov, having cooperated with the government, received a reduced sentence of 15 years. Dmitry, the Russian middleman, was extradited to face charges in a Russian court. On the one-year anniversary of the Anchor Bar operation, Sarah was finally called back to headquarters. She was brought into a large office with wood-paneled walls and an American flag in the corner. Admiral Robert J. Hutchins, the Naval Operations Commander, was waiting for her. "Commander Chen," Hutchins began, "we're here today to recognize your service and your sacrifice in what came to be known as Operation Anchor. Your work exposed a serious breach in our security. Your dedication brought criminals to justice. But more than that, your work helped us understand larger vulnerabilities in how we protect classified information." He stood and shook her hand. "Your country is grateful for your service." Sarah accepted the commendation, the official recognition, the ceremony. But what she carried with her was something else, the memory of what it meant to be invisible, to sacrifice your identity in service of something larger than yourself. She thought about Captain Richard Reed, now in a cell, paying the price for his ambition. She thought about Dr. Alina Volkov, learning to accept the consequences of her choices. She thought about Dmitry, caught in the middle of a conspiracy he had only partially understood. She thought about Marcus Reed, given a second chance to become the person he was meant to be. And she thought about all the people throughout her 23-year career who had been affected by her work. The families destroyed, the lives changed, the futures altered by her actions. That night, Sarah went to the Anchor Bar. It was a Friday evening, and the place was busy with the usual crowd of young sailors. She sat at her corner table, the same place she had sat while undercover. Jerry, the bartender, saw her and brought her a ginger ale without being asked. "Welcome back," he said. "We've missed you." "I've missed this place," Sarah said. As she sat there, watching the young sailors talk and laugh, unaware of the dangers they might face, unaware of the people like Michael Hartley who were testing their loyalty, Sarah understood something fundamental about her life. She would never stop being invisible. Even when she was in a uniform, even when people knew who she was and what she had done, she would always be the person in the corner, watching, waiting, ready to act when the moment came. That was her burden and her honor. That was what it meant to serve. And as she finished her ginger ale and paid Jerry for her drink, Sarah Chen smiled. She had come to the Anchor Bar as an undercover operative seeking justice. She had left as an undisputed legend whose sacrifice had changed lives and protected national security. The cocky young ensign who had shoved her in this very bar had no idea that he had pushed one of the most decorated and respected operatives in the Navy. He would never know the full extent of what she had done, the sacrifices she had made, or the price she had paid. And that was perfectly fine. Because true service, true honor wasn't about being recognized. It wasn't about being celebrated. It was about doing the right thing in the darkness when no one was watching, when no one would ever know. That was the legacy of Sarah Chen, not the medals or the commendations, but the invisible work that changed the world.